When it comes to virtual reality, there are two main components that really drive systems. The first being the headsets themselves, and the second, of course, is the type of tracking technology that they employ. But we can't neglect to talk about the third piece, which are the controllers, just because they help to drive the experience even more by being the extension of our hands in the VR space. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about all the existing set of controllers that are used by the various systems and how they compare against one another. So the first one I'm going to talk about here is the Xbox One controller for the Oculus Rift. Unfortunately, it does nothing to really enhance the VR experience just because it functions in the same capacity as your standard gamepad, meaning you just use it to control your character, move them around, but seeing that it doesn't have any sensors to distinguish motion or tilting, it's not going to be used all that much. So the level of interaction is kind of weak. The other controller for the Oculus Rift is the Oculus Remote. It also comes bundled with it. Unfortunately, just like the Xbox One controller, it really has no meaningful purpose in the VR world, with the exception that it's mainly used as a selection tool. So you have a selection button, a D-pad, and some other buttons on there to adjust volume and whatnot, but that's the extent of its functionality. There are no gyros, no sensors that would enable it to track motion and other stuff. And in fact, very few games rely on it just because you're primarily going to be using the Xbox One controller instead. The best controllers for VR right now is without a doubt the motion controllers for the HTC Vive. Now, at first glance, they look a little bit odd because of their shape and design, but they're so effective in making for a believable VR experience, primarily because of their ability to track spatial movement with relative responsiveness. There's very little latency, so every minute movement is precisely tracked. And on top of that, it does a good job of being an extension of our hands in the VR world. So for example, you have the trigger, which makes it feel like you're holding a gun and firing it off. And in some other games and experiences, it makes you feel like you're wielding a sword of some kind. And top it off, you have also the other side-mounted buttons, the touchpad as well, which all help to enhance the VR experience. Sony's DualShock 4 controller isn't new, but it's far more advanced than the Xbox One controller for the Oculus Rift. That's probably because it has the ability to track motion and tilting with its 3-axis gyroscope and a 3-axis accelerometer built in. Now, fundamentally, it acts like a standard controller, but with those sensors on board, it allows us to have a little bit more of an immersive VR experience. Technically, it's not new either, but the Move controllers for the PlayStation VR does a decent job of being extensions of our hands in the VR space. They act similarly to the HTC Vive motion controllers because, to an extent, we have articulation and movement of our hands. So basically, it does a decent job of simulating grabbing onto stuff in the VR space, or firing a gun using the triggers on them, or even swinging a bat. Now, it definitely has a little bit more of an immersive experience than just using the DualShock 4 controller, but it's still not as good as the Vive's controllers. That's partly because it uses older tracking technology. You have those LED lit orbs on its ends, and they're tracked by the PlayStation camera. Now, this particular implementation isn't as reliable or responsive just because if that line of sight is blocked, the tracking system can get messed up. Mobile VR is being enhanced thanks primarily to the new wireless motion controller for the Google Daydream View headset. In some way, we wish the Oculus Remote functioned similarly, but what makes the motion controller here for the Daydream View so useful is that it packs sensors that allows it to track the orientation of the controller while also approximating the position of our hand. So basically, it tracks motion to an extent. So in some of the games, it's able to act as a sword, basically. You could swing it around and it's tracked precisely. And that alone definitely adds to the immersion than just being a static form of interacting. And the last thing we want to talk about here are the Oculus Touch controllers. They're not out yet, but they're coming out this holiday season, and we got the chance to try them out during Oculus Connect 3. Like we said earlier, the Vive controllers are the best right now, but the Oculus Touch controllers are taking things to the next level. That's because it's notable for the fact that we get some degree of articulation with our fingers. The way it's designed, they feel more natural. You actually use your fingers to grab stuff rather than pressing a trigger on a controller. And they do a pretty convincing job of being our hands in the VR world. And that's about it. So if you guys want to learn more about any of the controllers I talked about in this video, you could check out our website, VR Source, your source for all kinds of reality.